Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about Tunisia. Tunisia is a country located in northern Africa that's currently going through an economic crisis. Once again, we've got a net importer, a country that is importing more goods than it's exporting, and is currently experiencing major problems in terms of a shortfall of foreign currency to be able to buy all of those imports. And also, it's got a large debt burden that it needs to keep servicing. And if you follow the channel, you'll know that there's a lot of other countries around the world in this exact same situation. And the usual way that these countries avoid collapse is by going to the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and seeking some form of bailout facility. And the IMF actually agreed a deal with Tunisia back in October 2022. However, the Tunisian president has rejected that deal. He doesn't want to implement any of the changes that the IMF have asked him to do. And unusually, the European Union have now come forward and offered an alternative bailout facility. And the main reason that the European Union has done that is that Tunisia, at its closest point, is located less than 100 miles from Italy. And during the first half of 2023, there has been an enormous increase in the number of migrants leaving Tunisia for Italy. So in today's video, I'll have a look at the country of Tunisia. We'll look at what natural resources it has. We'll talk about a major issue that occurred with regards to its tourism, because historically tourism was one of the biggest revenue generators for Tunisia. We'll have a look at what's going on in the economy, what's happening with inflation. We'll then go on to talk about the migrant situation, what's going on with regards to the IMF proposal, the European Union deal that's been tabled, and then finally today I'll wrap up with my summary. So what I think is likely to happen in Tunisia over the course of the next 3 to 6 months. Tunisia is located in North Africa and has an extensive coastline on the Mediterranean Sea. It has land borders with two African countries, Algeria to the west and Libya to the east. Tunisia is one of the Maghreb states in Africa, along with Algeria, Morocco and Libya. And of those four countries, it is the smallest. The country has a population of around 12 million. The official language is Arabic, and 99% of the population are Muslim. Tunisia has a long-standing history, and ruins have been found dating back to around 1000 BC. The country was colonised by France in 1881, but eventually declared its independence in 1956. In 2011, there was civil unrest and uprising, and it became the first country of the Arab Spring uprisings. In 2014, a democratic vote was held in Tunisia for the first time. Tunisia has a varied landscape. It has mild Mediterranean climate along its coastal areas. It has the Atlas Mountains in the northern parts of the country, which lead to the dry central plains where water is scarce. The central part of Tunisia is dry and arid and is the start of the Sahara Desert. Tunisia does have some natural resources. Oil was found in the 1960s in the deep south of the country, and it also has natural gas fields. However, that oil and natural gas is not sufficient to be able to supply all of the Tunisian needs, and it is a net importer of energy products. The other major natural resource that Tunisia has is phosphate, which is mined and used to produce fertilizer. And in the early 2000s, Tunisia was one of the top 5 producers of phosphate globally. However, problems with regards to internal fighting, the revolution, and strikes has meant that it has now fallen down to around the 10th largest exporter of phosphate in the world. Tunisia's biggest resources in terms of its GDP are its people and its agriculture. Tunisia's wage rates are low, and therefore it has a low labour economy, and the main products that it produces are electronics, garments and textiles. About 2/3 of the country are used for agriculture, and around 1/3 of the population works in this sector. The main agricultural products are olives, citrus fruits, grains, grapes, melons, figs and dates. Tourism was historically a big part of the Tunisian economy, and up until 2015 it represented around 20% of the country's GDP. However, following a terrorist incident in June 2015, when a gunman killed 38 tourists, including 30 British tourists, there has been a huge fall in the tourist industry in Tunisia. The two main food substances that the majority of the population rely upon are bread and couscous, and both of those items are made from flour derived from wheat. Now, Tunisia, like a lot of other countries around the world, provides subsidies to make sure that these items are priced at a level that people can afford. Now, the problem that Tunisia has is that they have a lot of poor people in the country, and it's estimated that the majority of the population spend around 80% of all of their household budget on food items. So that's put a lot of pressure on the government to absorb all of the increases in the prices. As we discussed earlier in the video, Tunisia is a net importer, and this chart, which shows the balance of trade, which is simply the difference between the value of the imports and the value of the exports, shows that Tunisia has been running a negative balance of trade in every one of the last 5 years, and that over the course of the last 18 months, that negative balance of trade has been getting worse. And the scale on the right-hand side of this chart is shown in Tunisian dinar, and the exchange rate currently is around 3 dinar to $1. So you can see that at periods during 2022, the balance of trade was running at negative 3 million dinar, which is more than $1 billion. And this chart shows the Tunisian current account over the last 10 years, and the current account is basically the bank account of the country. And the scale on the right-hand side here goes from 0 at the top to minus 6 billion Tunisian dinar at the bottom, which is roughly around $2 billion. And as you would expect, given the fact that Tunisia is a net importer, and we've just seen that the balance of trade has been negative in every one of the last 5 years, Tunisia has also been running a deficit on its current account. So you may be asking the question as to how Tunisia is actually managing to pay for all of its imports. Well, the simple answer to that is debt. And this chart shows the movement in the total national debt for Tunisia dating back to 2018. Which shows that Tunisia's national debt has increased from around $27 billion to around $40 billion today, and it's expected that over the course of the next 5 years, Tunisia's total debt will increase to around $60 billion. And to put that level of debt into perspective, this chart shows Tunisia's GDP dating back to 1992. And this shows that Tunisia's current GDP is running at around $50 billion. So total debt of $40 billion represents around 80% of GDP, which is an extremely high figure. So you're now probably wondering what's happening with inflation, because in a lot of countries like this, we see inflation going off the scale. And this chart shows the movement in inflation over the last 12 months. And you can see that the current official rate of inflation is 9.6%, which in relative terms, given what's happening in the economy, is not too bad. And if we expand the chart out to show what's been happening over the last 5 years, you can see that the current rate of inflation is actually a lot higher than the country has experienced historically, which at first glance appears counterintuitive because Tunisia is a net importer. It's having to import large quantities of oil and food products, and the price of those products has risen over the course of the last 18 months. And the main reason why inflation hasn't gone sky high in Tunisia is because the Tunisian authorities operate a system of subsidies. So the central government is basically absorbing any increases in costs, and they're not being passed on to consumers. So that explains why inflation in Tunisia hasn't gone crazy. In October 2022, the IMF announced that it had reached agreement with Tunisia to release $1.9 billion as part of a wider bailout programme. However, as with all of its loan facilities, the IMF required Tunisia to introduce a variety of reforms to put the economy back on track to try to get it to be able to stand on its own 2 feet. The new loan facility will support the authorities' economic reform programme to restore Tunisia's external and fiscal stability, enhance social protection, and promote higher, greener and inclusive growth and private sector-led job creation. Specifically, the authorities' reform programme will improve tax equity by taking steps to bring the informal sector into the tax net and broadening the tax base to ensure equitable contributions from all professions, contain expenditures and create fiscal space for social support. The authorities have already taken steps to contain the civil service wage bill and started to gradually phase out generalised wasteful price subsidies through regular price adjustments that link domestic prices to international prices while providing adequate targeted protection to vulnerable segments. Embark on a comprehensive agenda to reform state-owned enterprises, starting with the enactment of a new law. Strengthen governance and transparency in the public sector, including with a comprehensive governance diagnostic to establish a roadmap for reforms. Protect the purchasing power of Tunisians in the face of high and accelerating inflation. To reinforce macroeconomic stability, the Central Bank of Tunisia has to start to tighten monetary policy. Following a 6-month period of stalemate, where the reforms requested by the IMF were not introduced by Tunisia. Tunisia's President Kais Saied said that he would not accept diktats and suggested that the subsidy cuts requested by the IMF could lead to civil unrest in the country. When asked whether he would accept the terms of the loan, which include cuts to food and energy subsidies and a reduction in the public wage bill, the president told reporters, "I will not hear diktats." Recalling deadly riots that hit the North African country in 1983 after the government raised the price of bread, he added, "Public peace is not a game." When asked what the alternative to the IMF loan was, the president replied, "Tunisians must count on themselves." However, in contradiction of this, members of the Tunisian government have said that there is no alternative to an agreement with the IMF. The 2023 budget agreed with the IMF included a cut of $2.9 billion in subsidies. However, so far the government has not raised fuel prices in 2023, which has been done to avoid public anger as inflation is now at its highest level for 4 decades. We've just talked about the high levels of debt that Tunisia has, and Fitch, the rating agency, recently downgraded Tunisia to CCC-, which is basically junk status and is the lowest possible rating before we get to default. And in their recent report posted in June 2023, Fitch stated that the downgrade to CCC- reflects uncertainty around Tunisia's ability to mobilise sufficient funding to meet its large financing requirement. This reflects the failure to implement prior actions of an agreed IMF programme that would be necessary to release the associated bilateral financing that underpinned Tunisia's financing plan. Fitch are forecasting that the government financing need will be high at around 16% of GDP in 2023, which equates to around $7.7 billion. And 14% in 2024, which is $7.4 billion, which is well above the average of 9% in the period between 2015 and 2019. The reasons for the increase in the financing need are the high fiscal deficits and large debt maturities, both domestically, as the government has increasingly relied on shorter-term domestic financing to compensate for scarce external funding, and externally, including Eurobond repayments of €500 million due in 2023 and €850 million due in 2024. Fitch believe that there are high risks in the latest Tunisian financing plan, as the government requires around $5 billion of external financing, and the majority of this is due to come from the IMF programme, which is not likely to be mobilised during 2023. Fitch believe that if Tunisia fail to reach an agreement with the IMF on their latest proposal, then around $2.5 billion of external financing could potentially be raised from Algeria and other African nations. In terms of the IMF bailout, Fitch have noted that the IMF board did not approve the new $1.9 billion 4-year extended fund facility, which was planned for December 2022, as prior actions were not met by the Tunisian authorities. In particular, the president has expressed opposition to an agreed reform of fuel subsidies, and the revision of governance laws has not been approved. During the first part of 2023, there has been a huge surge in the number of migrants leaving Tunisia in an attempt to land in Sicily, which is part of Italy. This chart shows the total number of migrants arriving in Italy from Tunisia, dating back to 2014. You can see that in 2022, the total number of migrants was just over 30,000. However, in the first 4 months of 2023, there have been over 24,000 migrants. And Italy's Prime Minister has recently warned that Europe is facing a migrant crisis unless urgent aid is provided to Tunisia. In a recent interview, he said maybe not everybody is aware of the need to preserve the financial stability in a country which has severe financial problems. If we do not adequately address those problems, we risk unleashing an unprecedented wave of migration. And Italy's foreign minister was quoted as saying that he could see tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of boat migrant arrivals if economic aid is not granted soon to Tunisia. And following a recent meeting between the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and Tunisia's President, the European Union has confirmed that it's prepared to provide a $1.1 billion loan facility to help both rescue the Tunisian economy and also to deal with the migration crisis. A fact sheet released by the European Union said the body would lend Tunisia up to €900 million to help its macro finances once it finalised the terms of the IMF programme. The EU would also provide €150 million in budget support this year in the context of a reform agenda. In addition to those two facilities, the EU will also provide Tunisia with €100 million for border management, search and rescue, anti-smuggling operations, and returns rooted in respect for human rights. Von der Leyen went on to say that Europe was helping Tunisia's economy in other ways, including a €150 million digital cable link to Europe and a €300 million renewable energy power export project. She said the EU would also expand opportunities for young Tunisians to study, work and train in the EU and help them develop skills that could be used to boost the Tunisian economy. Tunisia's presidency said in a statement that it was creating a partnership with the EU to combat illegal migration, but the president also said the solution that some secretly call for is to settle migrants in exchange for money, a solution that is neither humane nor acceptable. The president went on to state that he would not accept Tunisia becoming a border guard for other countries. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video really to give you an update as to what's happening in Tunisia, which is yet another country that is sitting on the verge of a potential collapse. Now, in these situations, the usual solution is to work out some sort of deal with the IMF, get an injection of cash, and that cash can then be used to continue buying imports until the country comes to another crossroads. And back in October 2022, that looked like the most likely outcome. The IMF had concluded all of its investigations and offered a $1.9 billion facility to Tunisia. But the problem with IMF deals is that they come at a cost. Countries have to introduce reforms. They usually either have to increase taxes or reduce subsidies or reduce spending or all of those things. And the Tunisian president has decided that he doesn't like the terms that have been put forward by the IMF, so he's not prepared to agree to them. And he referred to the fact that the last time that subsidies were cut in Tunisia, it led to civil unrest. Now, the IMF facility was agreed over 7 months ago, and obviously during that time, Tunisia has had to keep paying for more and more imports. And the other major problem that Tunisia is facing is that it's racked up a lot of debt over the last 10 years, and a lot of that debt needs to be serviced, and there are repayments due. And as we saw earlier in the video, Fitch have now downgraded Tunisia to junk status, which is just above default. So Fitch, the rating agency, are expecting Tunisia to default on its debt obligations at some point in the near future. Now, the other interesting ingredient in the mix here is what's happening with the migrant crisis, because Tunisia is at the northern tip of Africa, so migrants who are looking to move to Europe often move through the country in an attempt to gain citizenship for the EU. And what we've seen over the course of the last 6 months is that there has been a huge increase in the number of migrants leaving from Tunisia's shores and arriving in Italy. And Italy are now so concerned about this situation that the EU have now stepped in and made a bailout offer of more than $1 billion to Tunisia. But the problem with that offer is that it's dependent on Tunisia agreeing a deal with the IMF. And obviously the situation with the IMF at the moment is a complete stalemate. So what that means is that the EU offer as it stands at the moment isn't valid. So the overall situation as it stands at the moment is that Tunisia is rapidly running out of cash. It needs more foreign currency to be able to continue buying fuel and food for its economy. And the deals that it's got on the table at the moment are considered to be completely unacceptable by the president. So in terms of the question of what's likely to happen over the course of the next 3 to 6 months, well, Tunisia is now sitting on the brink of a debt default. It simply doesn't have enough cash to be able to meet all of its debt obligations on top of all of the imports that it's having to pay for. So it looks at this point in time like Tunisia is very likely to default on its debt obligations at some point in the near future. And once that happens, it's likely that the situation will get worse, because once you're in default, it's very difficult to be able to raise more debt in the international markets. And if the president continues with his hard line of not agreeing to any of the IMF's terms and conditions, then he's not going to be able to access either that facility or the European Union facility. So there is a very real possibility that Tunisia could run out of cash. That would mean that they wouldn't be able to pay for the import of fuel and food, and that could lead to a complete breakdown of the Tunisian economy. So I'll keep you posted on any further news and developments as and when they happen. Hopefully you found today's episode useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. And here's something to put a smile on your face.